On January 3, 2026, American Special Forces did something almost no one thought was possible. In the middle of the night, they went into Caracas, snatched a sitting head of state out of his own military compound, and put him on a plane to New York. No coup, no negotiated exile, no slow diplomatic squeeze. Just a raid, straight out of a movie script, and by morning, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had ruled Venezuela for 13 years, was in a U.S. federal detention center in Brooklyn, charged with narco-terrorism. Venezuelans danced in the streets. Analysts called it the end of an era. Washington called it a win. 8 months later, the man is gone. The regime is not. The same party is in power. The same generals run the military. The same intelligence services still watch the same dissidents, and the country is, by almost every measure, still falling apart. So today we're asking the question nobody wanted to ask in the celebration footage. If you cut the head off a regime and the body keeps walking, was it ever really about the head at all? To understand why this didn't fix anything, you have to understand what this actually was. For months before the raid, the US had been quietly building pressure, warships off the Venezuelan coast, fighter jets in the region. A campaign of strikes on boats the Trump administration said were smuggling cocaine north. Officially, it was framed as counter-narcotics. Unofficially, everyone in the region understood exactly what it was building toward. Then, in the early hours of January 3rd, it happened. Codenamed Operation Resolve, or Absolute Resolve depending on which source you read, Delta Force operators, backed by CIA intelligence on the ground, hit Maduro's compound at Fort Tiun, along with military infrastructure across the country. Within hours, Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, were aboard the USS Iwo Jima, headed for New York. By the weekend, Trump was on Truth Social announcing it personally. The operation was a success, Maduro was in custody, and in his words, the United States was going to run the country until a transition could happen. It was the most aggressive American regime change operation since Iraq in 2003, and on paper it worked. The target was captured alive, extracted cleanly, and is now sitting in a Brooklyn detention center awaiting trial on charges that could put him away for life. So why, 8 months on, does Venezuela look less like a liberated country and more like a country that simply changed which crisis it's living through? Here's the detail most of the celebration coverage buried. Maduro didn't rule Venezuela alone. He ruled it through a machine, a network of loyalists in the military, the intelligence services, the state oil company, and the party apparatus, all of whom had spent 2 decades building personal fortunes and personal power around keeping that machine running. And that machine didn't get raided, it got a new operator. Within 48 hours of the capture, Maduro's own vice president, Rodríguez, was sworn in as acting president in front of a National Assembly that was still, at that same session, denouncing the American raid as a kidnapping. Her brother, Jorge Rodríguez, kept his job running parliament. The ruling Socialist Party retained every lever of institutional power it had before the operation. This is the part that gets lost in dictator-captured headlines. The United States didn't remove a regime. It removed one man from a regime that was built, very deliberately, over 20 years to survive exactly this kind of shock. Rodríguez herself is not some neutral caretaker waiting to hand power to the opposition. She's a 2-decade veteran of the Chavista movement, foreign minister under Chavez, economy minister under Maduro, and by most journalistic accounts, the actual operational architect who kept Venezuela's oil flowing around U.S. sanctions for years. Reporting has described her as running a parallel economy specifically designed to dodge the same pressure Washington was now applying directly. According to reporting from former U.S. diplomats who've watched Rodríguez operate up close, her approach since taking power has had a name inside Washington circles: moving as slowly as possible on reform, while doing just enough to make it look like compliance, essentially betting that American political attention has a shelf life, and that if she can outlast the news cycle, the pressure eases. Look at what's actually happened since January. Political prisoners have been released, but slowly, in trickles, and under numbers even human rights groups say don't add up cleanly. By mid-March, the government claims 621 releases. By mid-August, monitors were still counting roughly 260 people freed out of the hundreds who remained, with groups like Foro Penal noting the government's own figures sometimes recycle releases from previous years to inflate the count. Meanwhile, the actual architecture of repression hasn't been dismantled. The colectivos, armed pro-government militias that have controlled entire neighborhoods for years, are still on the streets. The intelligence service that Rodríguez herself used to oversee is still operating. And in March, she reshuffled the military leadership, replacing a defense minister who'd served over a decade with someone from military intelligence, a lateral move within the same system, not a dismantling of it. This is the core problem with a decapitation strike as a regime change strategy. It assumes the man at the top is the system. In Venezuela's case, the system was built, deliberately, over 2 decades of sanctions and pressure, to keep functioning with any one person removed. Maduro wasn't a lone dictator holding up a house of cards. He was the visible face of a patronage network that had already survived years of U.S. sanctions, an attempted opposition uprising in 2019, and international non-recognition. Removing him didn't remove the incentives holding that network together. Step back and look at the baseline Venezuela was already working from, because this is what fixing the country would actually require reversing. 2 decades of Chavez and Maduro-era mismanagement produced an 80% collapse in GDP. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans, roughly a quarter of the population, left the country entirely, one of the largest displacement crises in the modern world. That migration didn't just create a humanitarian emergency abroad, it fed the rise of Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang that's now a designated foreign terrorist organization operating across multiple countries, including inside the United States. None of that reverses because Nicolás Maduro is now in a Brooklyn detention center pleading not guilty to drug charges. The oil infrastructure Trump promised to fix and monetize is still, 8 months later, largely in the hands of the same state oil company, run under the same operational logic that existed before the raid. The migration hasn't stopped. The gangs the migration fed haven't dissolved. The generals who benefited from 2 decades of corruption are, for the most part, still generals. So if the country isn't fixed, what did the United States actually accomplish? It got a symbolic, made-for-television victory. The arrest of a man Washington had indicted years earlier, finally facing an American courtroom. It got a government in Caracas that is, for now, publicly cooperative rather than openly hostile, meeting with U.S. envoys, restoring diplomatic channels, and talking about energy and trade instead of imperialist vampires. And it opened the door to a renegotiation of America's access to Venezuelan oil, which multiple analysts have flagged as arguably the real prize in the whole operation. What it didn't get was democracy. Edmundo González, the man who most independent observers believe actually won the 2024 election, is still in exile in Spain. Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most prominent figure, escaped Venezuela and picked up a Nobel Peace Prize, but the government running the country isn't hers. It's the same party that blocked her candidacy in the first place, now negotiating the terms of its own survival with Washington instead of being replaced by it. One former U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela put it bluntly in a PBS interview. His real fear wasn't that the operation failed, it's that it succeeds at exactly the wrong thing. That Washington ends up striking a deal in which the current regime stays in power indefinitely, as long as it keeps the oil flowing on America's terms. This is the pattern that keeps repeating across modern regime change operations, and Venezuela is only the latest case study. You can remove a person with overwhelming force in a single night. You cannot remove a system that way. Systems are made of thousands of smaller loyalties. Generals who'd lose their income, officials who'd lose their immunity, militias who'd lose their territory. And every one of those people had a reason to keep the machine running exactly as it was, with or without Maduro standing at the top of it. 8 months after the raid that was supposed to end Venezuela's crisis, the crisis hasn't ended. It's just wearing a different face. One that knows exactly how slowly it can move, and exactly how long Washington's attention span usually lasts.